welcome to the most excellent 80s movies podcast. It's the podcast where a filmmaker, a comedian, and their ethical guests just saxophone solo their way through the 80s movies we think we love or might have missed with these our adult eyes. And today we are talking about The Lost Boys, a movie selection from 1987.
Michael and Sam have just moved to Santa Carla, California. They're about to discover its secret.
Notice anything unusual about Santa Carla yet?
No. It's a pretty cool place. If you're a Martian.
Or a vampire.
So where are you? The boy none?
I'm your brother, Sammy. Help me!
Stay back! Stay back!
What's happening, Star?
Get yourself a good sharp steak. Drive it right through his heart.
You're a vampire, Michael. My own brother, a damn blood-sucking vampire.
Oh, you wait till Mom finds out, buddy.
When a vampire bites it, it's never a pretty sight.
Michael, they're coming! Oh, shit!
That trailer suffers from the quiet, loud, quiet trope that trailers sometimes do, where it's like people whispering, Santa Carla's a great town. If you like weirdos or vampires. And then kablooey, there's a huge explosion sound. And that
I've made your podcast too difficult to listen to.
yeah. Trailers love doing that, or at least they did, but I think that they still do. I'm Chrissy Lenz, comedian and host of For You today, and with me is co-host filmmaker Nathan Blackwell.
Good evening.
Or day. It might be day, although it's spooky season, so we just assume it's always evening.
Yes.
Okay.
For our one spooky episode.
And with us is a favorite guest, friend of the 80s movies pod, our favorite ethical panda podcaster, Matthew Fox. Hello.
Hey, welcome everybody. I am once again glad to be back revisiting my childhood.
Yes, was this a favorite for you?
And what a horror it was.
So this is another one of the, first of all, like, you know, whoever came up with the idea of vampires as an 80s hair band is just beautiful. Like, and I have a lot to say about that, but
Joel Schumacher.
Yep, and this is another one of those movies where I've had a real evolution, because like I saw it in the theaters at 10 when, like, I mean, we'll talk later about how this is the first union of the Coreys. But to me, you had these like three badass teenagers who were hunting vampires and reading comic books and like talking back to their mother. And they just seemed like the coolest kids in the world. And then I got to be 14 and 15 and suddenly people were talking about this movie because apparently Kiefer Sutherland and some others were kind of attractive to most of the women wearing eyeliner and fishnets that I found attractive.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I was like, wait, but they were the bad guys. I don't understand. And we got into a whole new understanding of the movie. And that was not the thing that propelled me into goth and vampires and things like that, but it's a big part of it. And then I watched it again in my early 20s when I had, you know, come out to myself about being queer and was like, oh, this movie is really gay. Okay, that works too. So yeah, it's been, and then just watching it again this morning to get ready for this, it was one more of those kind of like risky business moments that I've had with you all, where I could be like, there's a lot of depth to this movie under the horrible acting and at times really bad special effects, but like Joel Schumacher really had some interesting ideas, and I'm really excited to talk about this movie because I've sort of seen all sides of it now, so. We're ready.
I love it. What about for you, Nathan? I couldn't possibly guess if this was something you loved or something you never saw. I don't know. I can't wait to hear the answer.
Yeah, this was, I was like, Of course I've seen The Last Boys. Like, of course I've seen The Last Boys. And
Okay.
I start The Last Boys is like, I have never seen this movie.
Oh
Like,
wow, okay.
at least, I've probably caught sections, caught clips, but I have never, to my, surprise, I have never seen this movie all the way through. I've probably never seen like 90% of this movie,
Wow.
But you know about The Last Boys because it's like a cultural touch point,
Mhm.
But yeah, it is as advertised, as good and bad as you thought, you know. Yeah, and I had a good time.
Yeah, it's all of that and more. I watched it with the whole family last night to prove to my teenage children that we were doing sexy vampires long before
Mhm.
Twilight. We
Right.
invented sparkly blood. um
Blood, I think.
Look, in
glitter
the
blood.
80s, our vampires had mullets, and we liked it.
We
Mhm.
liked it. They had
Right.
the
They
tightest jeans.
they had multiple earrings,
So many
frilly
earrings.
shirts, and leather at the same time.
I am I am and was into it 100%. Love the Corys, love everything that we are going to really delve into. There's a lot to mine, as Matthew said. Like there's a really oh so much for us to delve into, but for me watching it as a kid, it was the perfect combination of like, okay, there is a very cute boy who's probably meant to be like, the age I was when I was watching this, who's like safe and sensitive and then he's got this like, and you could imagine like you have a relationship with him. Like he's the person that you're like Mary suing yourself to. And then there's the troubled, uh, oh, so pretty older brother who's just like, let me in, Sam. And you're like, okay. and his friends who are just from the wrong side of the tracks because they're under the tracks and living on them upside down from this ceiling. There's just oh so much. So what we get a lot of the theme song for this movie, which is like a thou shalt not kill, blah blah blah. It's throughout the entire thing. And we start with like a nice cold open of this like pier and the families that are there to enjoy, and then of course the youths who are
Mhm.
making it an unsavory place to be. And we get a lot of Kiefer Sutherland with his earrings and his leather being told, you can't be here. It is incorrect for you to walk the wrong way around the merry-go-round. That's how you know they're bad, because they're walking on the merry-go-round in the direction opposite of where it's headed. So they get kicked out, and then of course we see the security guard get swooped up from an aerial attack by an unknown monster.
Mhm.
Dun 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 dun.
Cut to a family road trip. So many 80s movies.
What? Yes.
So many 80s movies start with the family road tripping to a new town.
Yes, and they're always coming from Phoenix, it seems.
That's where we send people away from us.
Uh-huh.
I was gonna say, if I was with Andy of the Marvel Movie Minute podcast, who's a dear friend of all of us, I would have to mock him because, like, I think Phoenix today is not a city that you really want, and this is before the Sunbelt explosion. So
Mhm.
to me, the idea that Phoenix is the city you want to go back to, like, they're keeping the bar fairly low, which I
Mhm.
appreciate. I do want to just say also, because I was someone who spent a lot of time in goth clubs in the 90s, that song Cry Little Sister by Jared McMahon, I think is how you pronounced it, or McMahon. He did not have much of a career, but that was like, if you went to a goth club anytime between like 93 and 2005, if you didn't hear that song sometime during the evening, it was a weird night. Like, it was
Yeah.
definitely one of the staples
This
of
night got weird.
Yeah.
Cry Little Sister. Great song. Very
Love it.
oddly used in this movie.
Mhm.
But it's what I remember, though. It's so what I remember. Like when I see the poster, I hear the little children, "Thou shalt not fall." I hear it in my
Mhm.
head.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. This movie is so stylish. You know,
Mhm.
like Joel Schumacher brings a lot to this movie. Like if you look at his filmography, there's some stuff that is just all over the map, but I feel like he brings a distinctive visual style, a distinctive fashion to be aware of the people who make it behind the scenes and how it influences it changes how you intake the movie. You know, like you don't realize how super gay this movie is until you start knowing like who made it. And he is, there's maybe two women in the whole movie. Like he is not particularly, like when we're talking about these rowdy youths, it's sexy young men.
Oh yes.
who are spending all their time together. And like one thing I noted that's really interesting is normally one of the tropes of the vampire movie is that the drinking blood is one of the most seductive things because it's this
Mhm.
like a neck kiss that turns into a bite that just turns into this ecstatic
Yes.
thing. And there's none of that in this movie. Like you
There
said, they
is really isn't. I feel like if Joel Schumacher was making it today, that there would be.
Mhm.
I feel like it was too sexual. There was a line of so much you could suggest
Yeah.
back then.
But I think it's also just because he's just not interested in women characters for the most part, and it's always sort of like I did a couple of podcasts on on his Batman movies, which
Hmm.
I used to think were terrible Batman movies
Good.
because they are, because they're not Batman movies, they're gay camp parodies of Batman, as which they're fabulous.
Right? Yeah.
But in those, he has very little interest in the women characters, just like in this one. Like Star only exists to quite literally, and the vampires only care about her to quite literally be bait for the next hot young
Hmm.
man they're going to bring into the group. And it's
Yeah.
just like there's so many different things here to tag on to, but just as we're saying, kind of with the overall stuff in the movie, I think when you're talking about that style, that look, it's easy to forget how much influence this movie wound up having. Like,
Hmm.
you know, a lot of folks have written great articles about how like Gen X was obsessed with vampires the way millennials are obsessed with zombies. And I'm too old to know what the Zoomers are obsessed with, but I think it's
Right.
the beast they can have sex with really is the
Chuds.
Zoomer thing
It's
Yeah.
that they want.
chuds.
But whatever it is, like, and I was looking back and reading some great articles. Like, is this just me who thinks this? You know, when people look at like that goth vampire culture, the kind of things that people most credit it to is the Bram Stoker's Dracula movie, which is a very
Yeah.
different kind of vampire, the Anne Rice novels,
Uh-huh.
and this book and this movie.
Yep.
Um,
Mhm.
and I think it's all like, and when the Vampire the Masquerade role playing game, which was a huge part
Mm.
of that goth sort of subculture that I was at least a part of in the late 80s and 90s, it's all about gothic punk, which
Mhm.
I you know, you go back and realize that had never existed until this was the first movie that said, okay, vampires can be super sexy like Bram Stoker and like old fashioned and English, but what if they're punks? What if they're badasses? What if they're 80s hair guys?
What if we can have all of that all the time?
So vampires have always been sexy, but you know, it's like you think of like that was with like Bela Lugosi. He tapped into that, but it
Mhm.
had always kind of been there, but it was never like, you know, it was meant for adults, and then kind of like became teenage lust, you know,
Yeah.
as they became cooler, you know, and it was less about adults playing them and
Right.
younger people using that as kind of like punk rebellion.
I think too that this viewing was the first time that I ever realized how like on the nose calling it the Lost Boys really is, tapping into that we're never going to grow up thing of like teenagers, and how this movie is sort of um almost are we afraid of teenagers? Is there a little bit of
Mhm.
like, I definitely identified with more with the mom character this time, being like, oh, you know, her boys are growing up and she's trying to have a life of her own. But
Mhm.
there's that whole montage of the beginning of the people are strange when you're a stranger. And it's like just all these youths. It's the punks, it's the teens, it's the people of Santa Carla. And it's like, oh, they're strange. They're different than who we would meet in Phoenix. Oh, I wanted to say too, And I'm gonna finish my point, but put a pin in the idea of like Bella goes from Phoenix to Forks in Twilight. Is there anything to tie that into
Oh,
these
that might be.
guys
Yeah.
going from Phoenix to Santa Carla?
I also appreciate you pronouncing it properly as Santa Carla because the mayor of Santa Cruz didn't want his town depicted because
Where
it
they
is
filmed it, yeah.
100% Santa Cruz. Including like I went to grad school near Santa Cruz and like it really loves its idea of like even for the California coast we're the weirdos. And it was
Yeah.
very much a
Yeah.
center of like young punks and goths and like all that kind of stuff as well as the aggressive surfers we'll
Mhm.
get to. So yeah, it is straight up Santa Cruz, just changing the letters a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it's what's fun to think about is some of these movies that become so like identified in the places that they were filmed by the local people, like the people of Santa Cruz. They do a big event where they play the Lost Boys like on the wharf or wherever on the beach every year because they embrace it as something of their identity. You know,
Mhm.
it was interesting to think about like Phoenix. It's like, well, we got like Raising Arizona, and we've got Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. You know, those are the movies that we identify with something that was filmed here, and there's screenings of the movie, you know, throughout the year at like certain events and things like that. But that's kind of fun to think about, like what movies are embraced in what towns, you
Mm-hmm.
know, in what cities do they kind of say this is, you know, because it was filmed here, we can see ourselves on the picture. It's part of our kind of local culture.
Yeah. And I love that. I would totally claim it as my identity. So this family is moving away, and it's the story that we get at the beginning of, The Karate Kid and several other movies, even Twilight, where the family has to move away from their old life and start a new life. Um, and they're moving in with the eccentric taxidermying grandpa who is such a fun character. Like he sort of is, just an old curmudgeon who's set in his ways and, is happy to have his family there, but shows it by bringing them taxidermy,
Hmm.
leaving it on their bedsides. And, neither of the brothers seem happy to be in this situation. But at the beginning, we really get a sense that the brothers have a bond and have like a really cute bond. And they like sort of tease each other and like kind of laugh together at the grandpa. And I really liked the relationship that we see in the very beginning between Diane Wiest, the mom, Jason Patrick, who plays our sexy Michael, the main teenage sexy boy, and Corey Haim, who is our safe younger brother alternative, who is the most
Hmm.
fashionable of the family. Um, but I really like that cozy moment we get where we get a picture of the family at the beginning.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot. We'll save this especially because towards the end, but there's a lot about family dynamics in this movie, which is kind of funny because the '80s were very much like all the sitcoms were about like nuclear families and stuff like that, and this is about a divorced woman with her family, which I noted especially that they don't like normally in order to talk about how like to make it okay to be a divorced woman who would like break up the nuclear family in the '80s, you had to make the ex-husband utterly horrible. They don't do
Hmm.
this at all. She's like, I didn't want to fight with him. I broke up with him because he didn't believe that monsters were in the closet. Like, it's a very clear, like, he's not a horrible person.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me, it was like, okay, so they're trying to do something interesting here about like showing like different ideas of what family can be. And we'll get to more of that as the family goes on and we get into the Brady Bunch of it all.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, like in the early '80s, you've got like mixed families and complicated families, and then as it goes kind of like late '80s or early '90s, it starts become kind of a lot more latchkey kids,
Yeah.
of like single moms and like untraditional families like that, like the kids having to fend for themselves and they get to run around and do adventures.
Mm-hmm.
But in this one, the chosen family is a family of deadly vampires.
Oh
So
no!
there's kind of a little bit of a twist on that. But as we're exploring Santa Carla and the central bit of it, which is the like pier and the boardwalk and the roller coasters, everybody's exploring. The boys are watching a concert where there are both balloons and trash can fires. An odd combo, but you know, Santa Carla Cruz knows how to live, I guess. They're like, we want plastic inflatables for the kids, but trash can fires for the adults. And of course, famously, the concert is a very greasy, beefed up saxophone playing
Oh
lead
my god,
singer.
the oily saxophone player of legend. He appears when called. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a Saturday Night Live skit to where they have this character effectively played by John Hamm. So basically, like it's like someone gets cursed, and throughout their life, at certain moments, he busts in through the door, being oily and playing the saxophone, played by John Hamm, until the curse is lifted.
I love it.
And to me, there's so much interesting in that choice. I mean, again, like the man's wearing a cod piece over his very tight jeans. So again, like there's some themes happening here that 10-year-old me missed when I first saw it. But also, like so much of the trying, like I mean, music often defines generations, especially like in terms of punk, goth, stuff like that. And there's a lot of that music. Like the first song we talked about is very much kind of like the Susie and the Banshees goth style. There's this cover of "People Are Strange" by Echo and the Bunnymen, which oddly they don't use the Jim Morrison version, but they have a big picture of Jim Morrison in the sort of vampire cave. It's like, sorry, Jim.
It's expensive, yeah.
But like in the 80s, like there was that music, and then there was the music like your parents listened to, such as Huey Lewis and the News. And that's exactly what this like punk saxophone player, their band sounds like. It's the most incongruous thing because like when I think of like I love good horn music and like ska comes back, but in the 80s that that man has played in a Huey Lewis and the News cover band. Like I would bet money on that because it is just so it's just such a weird choice for music for that scene.
Well, it's also a weird choice to have your lead singer also be your sax man because that you can't sing and sax at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's such a fun little beginning for this. And then everybody sort of splits off into the direction that they're going to head during this movie, which takes place over a surprisingly short period of time, where Michael finds Star and is beguiled by her and wants to follow her. Sam finds a comic book shop where he meets his two new besties, the Frog Brothers, one of whom is Corey Feldman, the other of whom is not Corey Feldman. And the mom meets the owner and proprietor of the local video store, which is the hippest, coolest, neonest, clear vinyl and neon colors video store this town has ever seen. She meets Max, the proprietor, and potential adult love interest.
And Grandpa from Gilmore Girls.
Yes. Um, and so we're off. Everybody has sort of picked the thing that will inspire them for the next crazy 3 days of activity in their new town with their new lives. Um, I want to ask a question, which is how old do you think these brothers are? Because I think there's an argument to say that Jason Patrick's character is supposed to be close to 17, 18. And so maybe Corey Haim's character is like 15, 16. But as I was watching, that's what I've always thought. But as I was watching this time, I was like, it seems more like Corey Haim is meant to be like 12 because he
Mm-hmm.
still wants to snuggle with mom. They worry about leaving him on his own, and he's still like seems very much like a little boy, which would make me think maybe Jason Patrick is more like 15, 16. What are your thoughts, Matthew?
So I actually did some digging on this because I love getting into like doing the research with these kind of crazy things. The movie was originally written to be Goonies with vampires. Like Goonies had been a big hit, and it was about prepubescent boys who were enjoying like, and that's like we talked before about
Mhm.
Lost Boys and how much it was an allusion to that. Part of the point with the Lost Boys is that they're all prepubescent, like, and that's part of why Wendy isn't a love interest. They want her to be the mother figure.
Mhm.
Um, and it was very, and which we're definitely
And
going to get
then
to
Joel
in a minute.
Schumacher got involved.
And apparently, Joel Schumacher brought someone in to do a rewrite of the script, but they left in some lines from the original script, and that's why, like, yeah, he wants to climb into bed with his mother. Why the mother he has a 10 o'clock bedtime.
Mhm.
He needs a babysitter. So yeah, I think that's part of why there's this kind of weird tension in the movie that at times it seems like they're all like originally I think they were all supposed to be 11 and 12 hunting
Mhm.
vampires, Goonies style. And then like, okay, but actually like adolescence is fun. Let's have some, and like sexiness is interesting. And yeah, so that's kind of where there's some clash there.
Especially in the moment where he's like taking a bubble bath and he's like, making his hair into a mohawk and bebopping around a la Kevin
Mhm.
McAllister, who is like 10. So I definitely was that what you're saying
Yeah,
really adds
we've
a
kind of
lot.
they kind of split it off into two groups. They kind of kept Corey Haim and his frog buddies as like the Goonie kids, and then they got to do a bunch of sexy rebellious teenagers trying to. And I feel like ultimately, like Lost Boys, and seeing like the iconic like red poster, like that feels original. That feels different than the Goonies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting. Like, first of all, I should comment that the Frog brothers are named Edgar and Alan, which I think is a clear like, look, hey, we know about horror and its like
Mhm.
origins. Um, and also, I don't know how many of our listeners know what we mean when we say the two Coreys, because it's Corey Feldman is playing the lead Frog brother. Corey Haim is playing the lead. He's playing the younger brother. And this is the first movie the two of them were together. They go on to be teenage heartthrobs in their own movies, but in a number of movies they're together. They were very good friends, and they wind up unfortunately being kind of this tragic story of what happens when like with young childhood stars, they both got into drugs. Corey Haim has passed away now. Corey Feldman is not having a great career either. I think he's actually like now like a born again Christian or something. But yeah, but it's for 80s movies, like the two Coreys, that was definitely a thing. And
Mm.
this is the movie where it all got started.
Yeah. It was definitely a thing for me, and I would go seek out a movie like Dream a Little Dream, which is not arguably a great movie, to see the two of them together. And I really loved both of them, and seeing them together is great. And at this point Corey Feldman was already so into drugs that he almost got fired from the movie, and he
Mhm.
seems, my adult eyes see him as such a young like baby that I'm like, you stop doing cocaine, you baby. And like there were stories of them being like, yeah, there was sort of two cultures on the set of like Kiefer Sutherland and Jason Patrick and JB Gertz and all the teens who were like partying together, and then the two little kids who would like go to the arcade and watch movies. And it's like, yeah, but they were still doing their own piles of coke. So it's,
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But
the
like,
innocence is all an illusion.
you know,
Um
there's a
Mhm.
song from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which is a wonderful show despite the horrible title, but it's called I Want to Be a Child Star, and it's very much about like I want to have all these terrible experiences. But like Corey Feldman is so perfect for this role. Like Corey Haim is fine, but Corey Feldman is just he just gives off such that like I know it all. I'm a teenager. I'm on the bad streets. I'm Van Helsing. I know how to kill vampires. And yet the other terror in clutching to his brother when the actual vampires show up. Like
yeah.
it's a ridiculous part that I think would have looked with a lot of teen actors, I think it would have just come off as very eye rolly. And yet I want like in the ridiculousness of this movie, I wind up really believing in his character.
And I really appreciated, because you keep sort of waiting for the Frog brothers to either be proven that they don't know what they really think they know, or that they're afraid, and they never are. In fact, when you think they're going to be afraid and bail, they're like, let's kill these two allies. Like, let's
Mhm.
kill our two friends while we can. And they really do know what they're talking about. And so all in one night, it seems, it may be a couple of nights, but he sees Star, he is lured by her, he eats, they go and have Chinese food, which I would love to see the cutscene of the two, Alex Winter and the other vampire boy, being like, okay, we need some white rice, because he's definitely going to do that thing where he pretends it's maggots. We need a noodle of some kind, but without a lot of vegetables in it, because he's going to do that thing where it looks like worms. And then I don't know. What do you think? A kung pao? Should we get it? Should we get a shrimp and lobster sauce?
What, like, have these people ever eaten Chinese food before? Because like you don't just take a carton and give it to each one person just eats rice, one person eats noodles, someone else is like just eating General Tso's chicken. Like, that's not how Chinese food works.
Yeah, they definitely don't have plates in their very cool dilapidated hotel turned vampire lodge lair. That's the word I was looking for. But it's that bit which has survived to the centuries, which is, you're enjoying your maggots, Michael, you're eating maggots, Michael. And they immediately want him to be one of them. There's like a little bit of tension at first, and they're maybe gonna fight over Star, but then immediately they're like, drink this weird wine, come hang upside down from a bridge with us, you're one of us. Immediately they're like, you are one of us now.
There's no vetting for this process. There's
No.
very less like, yeah, you seem cool. You're cool. All right.
You're one of us. Little do we know, we'll find out in the end that they're actively, trying to recruit Michael, it seems.
Right.
But yeah, it seems like this army of teenage vampires should be huge, but if they're just like, you, okay, you passed the can you ride a bike test, you're one of us.
I mean, he is very pretty in a way that I think that
Mhm.
they're supposed to be quite drawn to. And just the way Star is used in that scene is, to me, so telling, because it's like she's the bait. And like at first you might think Kiefer Sutherland's character David, like when he's like, no, you got to ride on my bike, not Michael's yet, is pulling the like, no, she's my girl, she's not yours. But instead you realize, no, it's just that he wants to kind of like just dangle her a little out of Michael's sight. Yet, it's like you've not quite earned her.
Mhm.
I really love Schumacher's ideas and a lot of his pictures. He he does not write women very well. He just
No.
No.
there's no interest in her as a character except just
Yeah.
and
Her
we'll get more
being
to that.
just her being just the wonderful Jamie Gertz, which I am there for.
That's fair. That's fair.
But she is warning him. She's telling him the whole time, don't drink it. That's blood. It's not really, it's just rice. It's not worms. She's like, look, you don't want to be here, bro. They are vampires. She's all but saying, and she's like, I can't tell you, but please don't drink that wine. It's blood. Then later he's like, it wasn't wine, was it? It was blood. And she's like, I did tell you
I
that.
did tell you that. I did tell you that.
There's so many visuals of Jason Patrick like closing his eyes and like biting into his lip and like just glistening as he like looks away from something. That should be the poster for this movie, because it happens so very often. And so he's like a half vampire. He's immediately a half vampire after jumping off of a bridge. He's sleepy all the time. He's grumpy to his mom. And the next night, I think, he has to babysit his brother. And as soon as the sun goes down, he's like, should I eat my brother? Should I? Will I eat my brother? Meanwhile, mom is like wanting to have a date with Max, the video store guy. And it seems like her story is the kids don't want her to move on and be happy by dating this video store guy. So that's her sort of narrative. But meanwhile, the kids have a lot going on. They're sort of being haunted by the vampire people. Michael sort of wants to eat Sam. He can't drink milk. But like even in that moment of tension, their brotherly bond sort of wins out because Jason Patrick is like, I'm still your brother. I accidentally sort of became a half vampire, but I'm your brother. Please let me back in the house and help me instead of you know, don't stake me like the Frog Brothers suggest.
I first want to just say, as someone who would, like a lot of kids at that time, spend a lot of time on the phone, and every now and then like wander with the phone and accidentally pull the phone cord out of the wall. He's holding on. He's trying to fly away, and he's holding on, flying outside the window, holding on to a phone cord. So
Yep.
some person who installs phone cords there is like cementing them in. I'm not sure what's happening there. But yeah, it's a fun, and I think this is a very much the vampiric story of like when you start having these impulses that go against your impulse and your logic, are clashing with each other. And I like that so often. Again, it's the will you kiss your girlfriend or will you drink her blood, and that it's not, it's that it's again very much about the family. It's about the brother, that he would want to kill his brother, and that he's holding off.
Because he loves him. And they want to help each other. Like they're immediately like at first he's like, "You're a vampire and I'm telling mom." And it's like, "Please don't tell mom. I'm only a half vampire. We can sort this out." And because he's met with the Frog Brothers and read the comic book, he understands that like because his reflection is at 50% transparency, he's half a vampire and there's still time. He has until we learn later, he has until he makes his first kill that he'll be a real vampire. But he ends up sleeping on the ceiling accidentally again. Mom is really mad that these boys won't let her just be happy. And then all the information starts happening. Max comes to the house. He gets invited. He like very transparently is like,
will you please invite me in?
You're the man of the house. Please invite me. And the Frog Brothers and Sam try and do all of these like tricks to reveal they suspect that he's the head vampire.
Well, with any vampire movie, they've got to play a game of what vampire rules actually apply to these vampires, because one of the things that one of the differences between zombie movies and vampires is that in these movies, everyone has heard of vampires beforehand. Like in almost every zombie movie, it's like, what is this sort of thing? Is it a walker? Is it a shambler? Like they have to kind of like invent the experience from nothing. But in these other things like werewolves and vampires, there's so much in our mythology. Like they know what a vampire is, they know what a werewolf is, and they have to kind of play the field of what of the ridiculous menu of like vulnerabilities or rules for these vampires actually are in this encounter.
But it doesn't make sense to me that because spoiler alert, Max is the head vampire. They were right, but none of their little tricks to catch him in the act of being a vampire work because they invited him in. Now, how does that work with vampire biology? If holy water burns you when you're not invited into the house, how does it not burn you when you are invited into the house?
Yeah, see,
I think when we get into the biology of vampires, we're kind of like, I actually really liked it because to me it was like, I often really like when movies are sort of like, yes, there is all this folklore, and the folklore is based in truth, but over telling and retelling and retelling, it's been mixed up, And so in this, yes, like all that stuff works, but like, because vampires come into their houses without being invited, but it's that if they're invited, then you're powerless against them.
Yeah, I feel like if they have the inviting rule, or B, holy water, then it is straight up supernatural. That it is like good and evil, God and the devil because why is there a biological difference between holy water and normal water, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then inviting someone in and not inviting someone in, that's definitely like something to do with a spell, you know, versus, oh, being out in the sunlight, I'm sensitive, it burns or whatever, I glitter, you know, glimmer or whatever. And or, you know, it's like this, you know, the silver or the stake through the heart. Like a stake through the heart would kill normal people too, so you could do that. But like the reflection, I'm gonna lump in there as well, because that's supernatural. There's no reason for them to be invisible if they're
Mm-hmm.
just happen to be, you know. It's like some movies, like in my mind, like Blade, that was more of a physical thing, you know, and then they would kind of like, you know, but yeah, so there's like the any kind of vampire movie, you're figuring out the rules. So
Mhm.
I feel like this is clearly in the supernatural realm, since they're dealing with the holy water and the permission. So there's a lot more of anything goes in terms of difference between a normal vampire and a master vampire, you know,
The
because
head
then
vampire, yeah.
right, because then you're talking about like, you know, sin and turning against God and Satan and
Mm-hmm.
being a product of evil and you know, how do these things work?
I will say, as someone who was the pastor of a church for a long time, we were not Catholic. We didn't really have holy water, but we had, you know, a font of water that was used for sacred purposes like baptisms and the like. And I did every now and then have these daydreams about, like, you know, what if two teenagers ran into my church in the middle of a service and like filled up their canteens? You know, I'd probably go help them. So
Yeah.
that and the fact that everyone in the church is just like, huh, okay,
Hmm.
let's go back to normal. That's
Santa
again,
Claus,
yeah, like
well, it tracks for this town, you
it
know.
Yeah.
does, it does. But yeah, you're right, and I think it's fun the way they play with that. And I think that they're, you know, every vampire movie has to, they have to set their rules according to what the plot needs. And like, to me, it's one of the reasons why Twilight doesn't work, because I find that I think the sparkling vampire thing just is ridiculous. But I mean, it's all ridiculous, I know, but it's that's where I draw my line. But to me, the way they set it up with this half vampire thing, it allows for Michael and Star to spend time together when all the other vampires are asleep. And it
Mhm.
Yeah.
allows to have this idea of Michael in this sort of like transitional state where he's moving towards the vampire, but it's still possible for him and Star and Laddie is the younger brother's name. We're just moving on. To all be saved. And I just love that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they can still be in sunlight. They're in a transition. They've been kind of like initiated, but they haven't like committed the sin yet. The
Yeah.
Mhm.
sin of drinking blood and feasting, you know.
And as soon as like while the dinner party is happening at the house, the dinner party is happening with the hairband vampires who are like, "All right, we're going to go eat these burnouts who are having a bonfire. Come on, we're going to eat them." And they just tear this like group of teens apart and they're like, "Well, you're one of us. The cat's out of the bag now. Guess you better eat someone."
Yeah, it's kind of fun that we don't actually see their vampire forms until an hour into the movie. Like they actually play the suspense, and
Mhm.
I mean, we know what's going on. We're going into it knowing what's going on, but it's fun to play out the suspense and the mystery of it and wondering, I mean, we know they're going to be vampires. What does it look like when they're vampires? And it's kind of fun that they kind of, you know, play the suspense and mystery of it.
What did you think of the vampire prosthetics?
I liked them. I thought they were about as for like, you know, like for movies back in the 80s, this was considered minimal, but this is as big as I would go. Like I'm not a fan of the really like ridgy foreheads that you kind of see in like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or some of these other ones, you know. um I liked it, and they were all a little different, you know, like each of them had a slightly different distortion on their faces, but you
Mhm.
know, the Joel Schumacher had to really kind of like draw them down, make it more minimal. But to me, this is as big as I would imagine getting, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, I definitely like it. And it's so interesting because it's like so much of the movie is about the sexiness of these people. They're the time that they are literal vampires is probably when they're their least sexy. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's certainly a monster love thing that happens to some extent, but as you said, it's not as extreme as Buffy, but it's that same, like, you take on this sort of ugly demeanor when you're about to attack as a vampire. And like,
Yeah.
that whole scene with the rival gang in town, because it's the people they're drinking the blood from on the beach. It's the same group they were kind of like messing with on the merry-go-round at first, and sort of they set up this idea of these are the rival gangs. At the time, a term that was often used for the people who'd hang out in surf towns and harass people and mug people and kind of make it clear that this was their beach and no one else could come in, was surf Nazis. They weren't like Nazis in any way, but that was the term that was used. There's a movie that comes out the same year called Surf Nazis Must Die, in which they are actual Nazis, which I would not recommend. It is really bad.
Who
But
knew?
like, but yeah, but I think that's also a little bit intentional. Is like they're not attacking innocent people. Like, they attack the couple who are making out in a car, which by horror movie standards means, granted, she's trying to push him away, so she's not quite as bad, but still, they attack the cop who is not letting them have fun. ACAB's not a thing when this movie is made. So the cop is like, it's sad that he dies, but like we never see them like really attacking, like, by the laws of 80s movies, innocent people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's people I think we would say like, yeah, they shouldn't get killed, but like by the
Right.
laws of 80s movies, all those people are somewhat okay getting killed.
It's interesting because it's almost by rebellious teenager laws rather than like monster laws. Like a lot of these like 80s slasher monsters, it's like, oh, you've tried to have sex, then you shall be punished. These are like, you kind of pissed off some teenagers and now you shall be punished.
Right.
That's why I was saying, like, I think this movie is a little bit afraid of teenagers. From that point of view of like, oh, they're getting up to shenanigans out there. What if they were allowed to do whatever they wanted? But I do think that Kiefer Sutherland, as Matthew pointed out at the beginning, doesn't seem like he's going to be, one of the more appealing figures in this movie, but he is. And even with his, like, he has such a unique face. And he definitely has like the cutest little puppy fat like on himself during this movie, but he is so appealing because he is so intense. And as this like leader of this gang, and always being like, Michael, you're one of us, Michael. Like, he may not be as like beautiful as a Jason Patric, but he's so appealing. And I was definitely, and he's so good at like doing this thing, even with all his prosthetics in them and out of them. He has this like actor move he does where he's like smiling or grimacing, and then it just goes into like a pouty frown that was just so impactful. That I loved Kiefer Sutherland's performance in this, and I think Kiefer Sutherland in this is the reason why I thought I loved the Young Guns.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I can see that.
But looking back at Young Guns, I didn't love it. Looking back at this, I still do. So everybody makes their plan. They're gonna rescue Star and Laddie. The Frog Brothers are gonna join them, and they're gonna go. Since it's definitely not Max who's the head vampire, they're gonna go find them and stake them. We learn that mullets look ridiculous hanging upside down. Even more ridiculous than they look hanging right side up.
Yeah.
Their weakness.
Can I just comment a little more about the recruitment scene and the
Please.
Kiefer Sutherland of it all? First of all, I think it's interesting because it's like a lot of movies now do this, and I think of it as the Aragorn Legolas, where there's two male figures of beauty presented, one of whom is like very like soft, classically beautiful, almost feminine features, but not quite, but like more like the feminine side of male, which, these things are big and broad, and that's totally great. And then one who's a little bit more like, and that's the Legolas, and one who's a little bit more like the grizzled, older, but very beautiful, but in a different kind of way. And that's the Aragorn. And I think that you very much have that with Kiefer Sutherland and Jason Patric here. And yeah, it's that like he's the boy. Jason Patric is the boy you might want to rescue. Kiefer Sutherland is the man you might want to kind of follow along with. And what I also think is so interesting is the way that blood is used, because again, there's no one is drinking blood from anyone else, but blood is clearly being passed to him through this bottle in this kind of like antiseptic way. I think it's in part because in the 1980s you just couldn't have a movie where the man drinking from another man's neck.
Mm-hmm.
But the other
Mhm.
part of it, I think, is that this is all, and Joel Schumacher's talked about this. This is made in the late 80s when, you know, HIV/AIDS is a huge concern for everybody, and the idea of any kind of sharing blood is very much
Mhm.
like that's very much in people's minds when they're watching a movie like this at that time. And so I thought the way that they do it, of the blood being kind of hidden, like it's not obvious you're having direct blood to blood, skin to skin contact, but it's through this bottle, and you're told it's not blood, but it is, which is very, very interesting, like in that kind of context.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Oh. But all great points. That's why we bring you here, Matthew. You got the good stuff. It's so cool how many different ways there are to look at this movie and still appreciate it. Because there's a layer too of like, and this was brought up in like the articles and things that have been written since, is like, is the Corey Haim character meant to seem a little queer? Like he's, you know, all of the cliche things from the 80s that we would possibly point our finger at and say like, okay, he's got a picture of Rob Lowe being very sexy on the outside of his closet, and he is you know, the cleanest, most fashionable, dapperest kid in this family. Is he meant to be a little bit queer? And would we then get the feeling that like the way that he's accepting his brother as being a half vampire and just being like, well, this is the reality we've got, let's go forward,
Mhm.
you know, would his brother have that same acceptance for him? And the mom
Mm-hmm.
so badly wants to be friends with these boys.
Yeah.
um and she's
She
her
Diane
own
Wiest
way.
does so much with so little.
Oh my
She
But
really
god, she
does.
does.
she's great in this. She's always great.
In
And
many
as
ways, I feel like this movie is an audition for the movie she later does, only 2 years later, Parenthood,
yes.
where
Mhm.
a comedic movie, but a much more serious movie. But again, where she's the parent of a couple of teenagers, who she doesn't really know what to do with. One of whom is dating, and I think his debut, Keanu Reeves, where he first shows his like brilliant acting chops. This is a tangent of a tangent of a tangent, because he's very much playing Bill from Bill and or Ted from Bill and Ted, but then has this one moment of like pure insight, and then shakes his head and is like, whatever. But the connections between Diane Wiest's character in that movie and this movie are very strong, and I was like,
Mhm.
oh, I forgot this is Diane Wiest, but yeah, this is the role she's born for.
Yeah, I love her so much.
Mhm.
So everything fails, of course, and there's going to be a big showdown at Grandpa's house where the Lost Boys are coming to get Michael, to get Star, to get Laddie. And there's going to be a fight. The frog, but they do a whole Home Alone thing where they're like setting up the booby traps and getting ready for a vampire fight. And the vampire fight is pretty satisfying. It's the grossest part of this whole
Oh my
movie.
gosh, yeah, it definitely jumps a line at some point of like what your expectations when we get to like the toilet and all the plumbing just erupting in blood.
Especially because what starts it is holy water being squirted out of these little squirt guns. Like,
Hmm.
like they're just the ridiculous like neon plastic water guns that you
Mhm.
give to 6-year-olds. And yeah, that scene to me felt the most like it didn't quite know what it wanted to do. You know, in terms of like
Hmm.
some of it is like Goonies level of horror gore, but in a ridiculous way. Some of it's supposed to try to be actually scary, and like it works, but it's very all over the place.
Mhm.
Yeah. It is, and it's gross. But they dispatch of the two extra vampires really quickly. They've already killed Alex Winter, and so of course it's down to the strongest of them all, Kiefer Sutherland, David, to fight against Michael, because like Kiefer Sutherland is not falling for the idiot traps that the other two stumbled into. It's clear that there's going to have to be a sexy vampire versus sexy half vampire showdown. Meanwhile, Laddie, the little boy, is like vamped out and he's like, oh, I want to bite somebody so bad. And they're like, no
No.
vampire.
Spray, spray, spray.
Yes,
Also
sit.
confirming the roles people have. Before he vamps out, they're fully ready for 8-year-old Laddie to be one of the people fighting the vampires, while Star, the teenage girl who's 3 times his size and could probably actually be a decent fighter, has to stay hidden.
Mhm. Yeah, but she's there to protect him. Like, she has somehow, like, yeah, she loves him and wants to protect him. And she's like, don't you? The Frog Brothers are like, we're gonna stab you and we're gonna stab you. And she's like, stop it, you two, stop it. But while that's going on, David and Michael have to have their big fight, and so they're just like up in the rafters of Grandpa's house, which has deadly antlers on both sides of the ceiling. And they decide to fight, like, okay, I'm gonna shove you at the antlers. Nope, my turn. I'm gonna shove you at the antlers.
There's a wall of antlers on each respective side that they are they're trying to push each other onto.
It's over pretty quickly. Like, even though there's a nice in-air moment where Kiefer Sutherland is saying, I don't want to kill you. You're one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you love to just never get old and never die and hang out at the pier all the time? Why are we fighting?
Even though we later learned that the head vampire Max requested them to kind of get for them to be turned into the family, Kiefer is genuine with his offer. Like, he's not just the mustache twirling villain. He genuinely wants him to be with them,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I heard was another way that it's kind of like playing with vampire lore is that in most vampire stories, there's this feeling of regret of like, I don't want to make you a vampire because I have to live eternally and I can never walk in the sunlight and I can, I want you to be with me maybe, but like, it's a tragic, sad life. There's none of that here. They're just teenagers who don't have to worry about going to college. They don't have to worry about laundry. They don't have to worry about getting a job. They just get to be teenagers for eternity. And like, that's such a, the fact that Kiefer like genuinely believes, he's like, why wouldn't you want this? This is great. And I think what makes the movie so fun is the movie's kind of saying that as well. Like, it has to have the evil defeated, but it definitely does. It presents them as like, yeah, maybe they kind of have the right idea on some terrible level.
And they are lost. Like, you get the sense that this town is like full of kids who are lost or abandoned, and it's like they're finding their like we said, their chosen family is full of murderers. So then once we reveal that Max truly is the head vampire, he wants Diane Wiest and he wants them all to be a family. It seems like he's gonna win, right?
And that moment was, to me, like, that was the movie where everything they're doing in this movie with families clicks into place, because someone makes a joke about the Brady Bunch, and actually that's exactly what what Max wants. He wants like the father who has a couple of kids and the mother who has a couple of kids to become a merged family. But no daughters, because there's women don't really matter in this world except as mothers. Star being mothering towards Laddie, and he like, there's a lot of these things that you see that just sort of marks him as like very much the patriarchal guy who wants the 1950s life. I always think that kids need discipline from a strong mother, he says, and the way he treats her and stuff like that. And it was just such a like, okay, this is really kind of playing with the idea of maybe the nuclear family, mom, dad, and a bunch of kids, isn't that great. And maybe like the weird old grandpa and the divorced mother can actually be the better kind of family.
Yeah. Which is the button on this movie, is that just when we think all is lost and Diane Wiest is going to choose to have her family live as vampires than die in a mortal life, kablooey, Grandpa comes crashing through in his Jeep, and the stakes, his fence that he's making out of sharpened wooden phone poles, come flying in and save the day. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's over. Oh, Michael's back to normal. Laddie's not trying to eat anyone anymore. The day is saved. And Grandpa just shambles off to the fridge, opens his root beer, and says, "That's one thing I never could stomach about Santa Carla. All the damn vampires." And we're out. um I really enjoyed this rewatch, and I totally see why this is a cult movie that gets played everywhere every Halloween, and of course in Santa Cruz all the time. But on a scale of one individual serving of rice slash maggots to 10 individual servings of rice slash maggots, 10 being the best, what do you give The Lost Boys, Matthew?
It's one of those movies that I feel like is very hard to put on that kind of a scale, because when I'm in the mood to watch it, it's perfect. It is a 10 out of 10 of being a so bad it's good, ridiculous cult vampire movie. But it's not a very good, like, it's a brilliant movie. It's a movie that really had a huge amount of influence, and that's a lot of fun.
But is it a good movie? That's the
Yeah,
question.
so I think, like, you know what it is? It's the bad Chinese food of movies. Like,
Yeah.
there's always in your neighborhood that one place that just makes 8 different kinds of breaded fried chicken and different sauces, and there's always 3 times as much breading as chicken, and the sauce is just pure MSG, and it's horrible for you, and it's not good food, but when you're craving it, and I don't even mean, like, I don't smoke pot, but that's another, like, just when you're craving that, it's exactly, this is the Taco Bell of movies. This is the bad craving of movies. So yeah, I think
I like the Chinese food reference. Yeah,
on
that
a
works.
scale of 1 to 10, I have to give it like a 5, maybe a 6.
Okay.
But it's just such an important movie in terms of impact, and when you're in the mood for it, it is exactly what you want.
That's the pull quote. This is the Taco Bell of movies. So do you land on a 6?
I think I'll put a 6, yeah.
Okay. And what about for you, Nathan?
So I agree with many of the things that Matthew said. I think I'm gonna end up on a 7. I feel like in the 6 zones, there's a lot more disappointment. This is definitely fun, but in terms of it's not a it's tough. It's so hard to word something that is a good time but is objectively not necessarily great. But it is a fun good time, especially if you're in the fall, especially if you're in October, like this. Like if we had watched this maybe in the middle of summer, which, I mean, here in Phoenix it's still like 99 degrees, so I mean, whatever. But I probably would have rated it lower, but I'm in the mood for Halloween.
Yeah.
So The Lost Boys squeaks out to a 7.
I love it. I when I am considering what makes these movies still high in that category, it's also like the rewatchability with other people who haven't seen it, or and I take into consideration a lot how my kids would view it. And so having watched this with both of them, they both really liked it, even if the 16-year-old liked sort of teasing it. The 12-year-old was like, he got jump scared and he was like really in it, and like they both really loved it. So I completely agree with everything that you guys have brought to the table, but I'm gonna go one higher and say I would give it an 8.
Wow.
I really like it.
To me, it's more like fun. It's that kind of like on a trash cinema scale or fun cinema scale. Yeah, it's an 8. On a art movie. The other thing I'm interested in what you said about your kids liking it, because I know nothing about your parenting style, but like I imagine your kids have had some introduction to other 80s movies, given your particular love of them.
It's true.
It is so. To me, it's like if you put a historical capsule of like important movies that define the 80s, this has to be in it, along with like Top Gun.
Oh, there's a mullet inside here,
and 16 Candles and stuff like that. and I do like, I'm very curious what like a 25-year-old who doesn't really know all the 80s references, what they would think of it, because I
Mm,
hope it would be a cult classic, and it sounds like it might be. It also might be that no one who wasn't born in the 70s or early 80s is going to have
yeah.
any idea what this movie is unless their parents love that stuff too. So I'm just very
Yeah.
curious.
And we did watch during the quarantine of the pandemic all the Twilight movies. We hate watched all the Twilight movies.
Mhm.
And so they all have opinions about vampires and teenage vampires on top of all of it. Um so it's deep cut recommendation time. Uh
Mm.
if everybody knows, if you like the Lost Boys, you'll probably like blank blank blank. But what would you recommend to people slightly off the beaten path? It's not going to be what Amazon recommends you watch next. Could be a Vampire Connection, could be a Corey Heldman. That's what I
Corey Haim and Corey Feldman. Yeah.
yeah. Together. What do you think, Nathan?
So mine is not going to be deep. Mine is going to be terribly not deep.
Okay.
And that's What We Do in the Shadows.
You took mine.
Here, let's say ours together.
Okay.
Okay, so you can pile on it and talk about it too. There's a couple of references that like What We Do in the Shadows like bases its vampires on. I feel like firmly one of its sources of like what are the powers of vampires falls within the domain of the Lost Boys.
Mhm.
Like nakedly so. Like one of the vampire literally does, and I think it's specifically meant to be that he's seen the movie and he's now doing the tricks, but it's like, oh, do you like your biscotti? Oh, look at your biscotti real closely. Oh, is your biscotti worms now? Like they full on do the trick, and it's like, oh, I guess that's from Lost Boys, I think.
Yeah. Perfection. That's my deep cut recommendation too, both the movie and the series. The series is in its 4th season now.
Mhm.
Um and I still find it delightful. There's a really lovely moment towards the end of this most recent season, which I won't spoil for you, but it's worth watching.
It's
Yeah,
Taika
so
Waititi at his best. I think
oh
writes and
Mhm.
directs that show. He's so good.
yeah. He is so good, and it's fun vampires. I like fun vampires.
Mhm.
But I do think it's so funny because one of the one of the key like ingredients of What We Do in the Shadows is that Guillermo wants so badly to be a vampire and isn't allowed to be, whereas the Lost Boys vampires will literally make anyone a vampire so easily.
Mhm.
What about you, Matthew? What's your deep cut recommendation?
So I'm trying to think of. There's a couple different that come to mind. First of all, it's just the ones that I've recommended that I've already talked about. Like I think watching Goonies will give you a good idea of like the ground this movie grew out of, and watching Bram Stoker's Dracula will also give you a good idea of like the other side of the vampire mythos and like how those two movies really defined, I think, the 1990s and goth culture and all that. And Parenthood, which I've mentioned, like it's for the Diane Wiest side of it, and just seeing her as a very different role. But I think the one that I'm going to mention that I haven't mentioned before as a deep cut is The Crow, because The Crow to me is like,
Oh.
this is very goth. This movie is very punk more than anything. Like there's no black fishnet or anything like that, but it is. This movie is also where I think like punk starts to become goth in terms of like the vampires and living at night, and nocturnal. And The Crow is probably to me one of the another one of the most definitional movies of like early 90s, mid 90s goth. You know, like
Yeah, for sure.
if you were hanging out with a bunch of people all dressed in black and wearing black Converse in the mid 90s and someone quoted The Crow and you didn't get it, like lots of eyebrows went up. You know, what are you doing here? I'm not saying gatekeeping was good, but like
Uh-huh.
it's, if you want it, I'm fascinated by the way cultures evolve out of movies. And like, I think if you're interested in sort of like seeing that progression, I don't think The Crow gets made without this movie. And like The Crow's very different. It's much more goth, it's much more martial arts, but it's building on the goth world. And I think in many ways it's kind of a successor to Lost Boys. So that's what I'd recommend.
Yes. So speaking of finding your podcast, where can people do that and listen to all of your fabulousness?
Yeah, so thank you. As I mentioned, I do a couple of podcasts. You can find them all under The Ethical Panda. TheEthicalPanda.com is the website. The two main ones I do are superhero ethics, where we just get into like all kinds of like ethical questions and interesting debates from superhero movies, geek movies. We've kind of made it pretty broad. We did a couple things on we recently did we've done Cobra Kai for a while because martial arts in TV is sort of a superpower, and we did Rounders, which is because poker is a superpower. We've had a lot of fun with a lot of great movies. There's a lot of interesting discussion. I think both of you have been guests at various times to talk about different things there. And then the Star Wars Universe podcast, that is pretty exclusively to Star Wars. And we've done a lot of great things there. Right now, we're doing episode by episode coverage of Andor. If you're kind of watching that show and want to follow up, or if you're going to watch it later, you're going to binge watch it later, which I think is my partner's going to do that, which gives me a chance to rewatch it. Come back to our episodes. We'll be we're recording right after a new episode comes out, so there's never any spoilers about what's to come next or something like that. But there, we've also done coverage of all the other shows beforehand. We're in the middle of doing episode by episode of Star Wars Rebels, which will continue on after the show is done. Star Wars just keeps. We were like, we'll just do all the old content, but they keep giving us new content. It's very frustrating, but really good. So that's a really fun one.
Highly recommend all around. And Nathan, where can people find and support your filmmaking endeavors?
Probably the easiest place is squishystudios.com. Also, our the feature film is wrapping up post-production that we're working on. We're starting to submit it to film festivals. That's The Last Movie Ever Made, which you can also find Last Movie Ever Made on Facebook and Instagram. I think we're under Last Movie Ever for Twitter. Not that I tweet that much.
Yeah. Excellent. And please follow, rate, review the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast. You can hear me additionally on the Saturday Matinee podcast, and sometimes as a guest on the Film Board on True Story FM. Be sure to follow, star, rate, review, high five, and hang upside down with your mullet to appreciate all of those things. And of course, while you're out there in the world, do keep the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast motto in mind. Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes. Yeah, excellent. That was a great one, you guys. Boy, I really feel like we nailed it all. That was such a
it was
good
bound
episode.
to happen eventually.